The dust had settled into the creases of their faces like a second skin. Pressed her palm against the wooden rail of the wagon, feeling the splinters bite into her flesh as the frontier town materialized through the haze, a scatter of weathered buildings that seemed less constructed than simply abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Behind her, 9 other women sat in silence, their bodies folded into the cramped space like bolts of fabric someone had carelessly bundled away. No one spoke. Speech had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The wagon lurched to a stop outside what might have been a trading post or saloon. The distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that they had arrived. After 43 days at sea in a hold that reeked of human waste and desperation, after 3 more days rattling across an endless landscape of scrub and stone, they had reached their destination, the promised land. The opportunity that had been whispered about in the narrow alleys of Canton passed from mouth to mouth like a sacred secret. A chance at wages, at dignity, at futures that didn't belong to fathers or husbands or the tightening fist of poverty. His daughter was 12. She descended the wagon first, her legs nearly buckling beneath her, and caught her elbow, steadying her. The girl's eyes were wide and colorless with exhaustion, her lips cracked from dehydration. They hadn't been given nearly enough water during the journey. The man who had arranged their passage, a thin-faced broker with tobacco-stained teeth, had calculated exactly how much they would need to survive and provided considerably less, pocketing the difference. Such mathematics were common in the world they came from. "Don't look afraid," whispered, though her own heart hammered against her ribs like something desperate to escape. "We are strong." It was a lie, but necessary. The town proper consisted of perhaps 30 structures, most of them leaning slightly as though exhausted. A general store, a blacksmith's operation where smoke poured from a chimney, several wooden buildings with boarded windows, and saloons, at least 3 that could see, their doors perpetually swinging open and closed, releasing gusts of laughter and curses and the smell of alcohol and male sweat. The streets were unpaved, ankle-deep in dust that rose with every step, every hoofbeat, every wagon wheel. There were men everywhere, rough-hewn miners with calloused hands, ranchers with sunburned faces, drifters with hollow eyes and slung low. The architecture of masculinity, weaponized and sprawling. Not a single welcoming face turned toward them. The wagon driver, a taciturn man named, began unloading their meager possessions, cloth bundles containing everything they owned in this new world. A change of clothes, small personal items, nothing of value, certainly nothing that would protect them. He worked with mechanical efficiency, indifferent to the women who gathered their bundles and stood uncertainly in the street, unsure whether they had the right to claim space in this landscape. A man emerged from the largest of the saloons, his belly preceding him, his suspenders straining against the weight of prosperity or simply excess. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, the kind of person who expected his presence to command attention, and finding his expectations met, grew only more convinced of his own importance. He spat into the street and surveyed the women with the expression of someone examining livestock at an auction. "You the Chinese labor," he called out, his voice thick with contempt. Stepped forward. She had learned minimal English but enough for transactions, enough for survival. "Yes, we are here, we work." She kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled. The man laughed, a sound without humor, all sharp edges. "You work, do you? Well, there's work aplenty in this town. You'll find that soon enough." He gestured vaguely toward the eastern edge of the settlement where several larger structures stood apart from the main cluster of buildings. "You'll be staying over there, away from the respectable folk. There's a place that's been set aside." Set aside meant the smallest, worst structure could see. A long, narrow building with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls that looked as though they'd been constructed from salvaged scraps. No windows. A single door that hung crooked on its hinges. The journey to their quarters took perhaps 3 minutes. 3 minutes in which the women followed the man in silence, their bundles clutched to their chests like shields, while townspeople stopped and stared. A few shouted words that didn't understand but whose meaning was abundantly clear in the tone, harsh, derisive, containing the particular cruelty reserved for those deemed less than human. A child ran alongside them for a moment, mocking their gait, their clothes, the way they kept their eyes downcast. One of the younger women, Jin, flinched at every sound. The building smelled of mold and old wood and something organic that had died and been left to rot. Inside, the light was meager, filtered through cracks in the structure. There were no furnishings, no beds, no chairs, no stove, just a concrete floor and the hollow echo of their footsteps. "This is your home," the man said, and there was something almost gleeful in his voice, as though he had done them a kindness by providing shelter. "You'll work the laundries and the boarding houses. You'll keep the miners' clothes clean. That's what you're here for. Wages will be paid monthly, less deductions for housing, food, and anything else we determine you owe us." He paused, letting this information settle. "Any questions?" No one spoke. He left them there as the sun began its descent, leaving long shadows across the desert floor. The women stood in their new home, and the word home felt like profanity, and something that had been wound tight in each of them seemed to wind still. Felt it in her chest, a sensation like drowning on dry land. She had brought her daughter across an ocean based on promises made by men who profited from desperation. She had sold the last of her mother's jewelry to pay their passage. She had told herself repeatedly that this would be worth it, that the wages would allow them to build something, that their sacrifice would transform into opportunity. The reality was a room with no windows and a future, no wider than a slit. Leaned against her mother's side, her small frame vibrating with barely suppressed tears, pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, the only familiar thing left in the world, and made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. They would survive this, not because it was easy, but because survival was what women like them did. They bent and endured and found meaning in the smallest mercies. It was then that she heard it, the sound of water running, somewhere beyond the building. Not the timid trickle of a hand pump, but the robust flow of abundant water. The sound made something in her pause. In a town where water was precious, where desert surrounded them like a siege, the abundance of flowing water suggested something impossible. She stood very still, listening, while the other women began the work of arranging their bundles into makeshift beds, of transforming despair into routine. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find the source of that water. Because in a place that had offered them nothing, the promise of that sound, that inexplicable, generous sound, felt like the first real thing she'd heard since arriving. The laundry work began before dawn, and the other women hauled water from the town well, the same well that served the miners and ranchers, though they were made to wait until the men had finished, collecting what remained in buckets that felt heavier with each trip. The work was monotonous and brutal, scrubbing shirts stained with blood and sweat, boiling fabric in vats that burned the skin, wringing cloth until the muscles in their forearms screamed. By midday, his hands had begun to crack, small fissures appearing between her knuckles where the harsh lye soap had stripped away any softness her skin had retained. But she had heard the water again. That morning, while carrying buckets back from the well, she had paused at the edge of town and listened. The sound came from the northeast, beyond a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the town's boundary. It was unmistakable, the rush of something abundant and natural, indifferent to human want or desperation. She had mentioned it to no one, fearing that any notice of it would result in it being claimed, controlled, or to them. On the third evening, a man appeared at their building. He was not young, perhaps in his middle years, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. But unlike the other men in town, his eyes held something other than contempt or indifference. When he knocked on their door frame, a courtesy none of the other townspeople had extended, felt something shift in her chest, a wariness that bordered on fear. Kindness from strangers was rarely free. "I'm Thomas," he said, his voice quiet and carefully respectful. "I run the boarding house on the north side. I've been meaning to speak with you." Stood in the doorway, pressed behind her legs. "Yes." I've noticed the women in this town are worked hard without basic dignity. He paused, as though choosing his words with deliberate care. There's a natural hot spring about a mile northeast of here. My grandfather discovered it when he first settled this land. I've kept it maintained over the years. He shifted his weight and could see he was nervous, which somehow made his words more trustworthy. I thought perhaps your people might benefit from access to it, for bathing, for rest. The other women had gathered behind now, their exhaustion temporarily suspended by curiosity and confusion. Hot water. The phrase seemed to belong to another world entirely, one where comfort was not a luxury reserved for the violent and wealthy. Why? Asked simply. His jaw tightened slightly. Because it's the right thing to do. It was such a straightforward answer that it bordered on absurdity. In his experience, men did not offer kindness without calculation. And yet something in his face suggested that this man had perhaps grown tired of calculation, had perhaps reached some internal threshold where his own conscience demanded action regardless of cost or logic. That night, after the other women had fallen into exhausted sleep, made her way alone to the spring. The walk took longer than had suggested, but she moved deliberately, following the sound of water and the faint outline of a worn path. When she reached it, she stopped entirely. The spring formed a natural pool, perhaps 15 feet across, steam rising from its surface in delicate wisps that caught the moonlight. The water was clear, heated by the earth itself, and completely untouched by the dust and desperation of the town. For a long moment, simply stood there, unable to process what she was seeing. She removed her clothes slowly, as though in a trance. The night air was cool against her skin, but it barely registered. When she stepped into the water, her body responded before her mind could catch up, a gasp, a surrender, a kind of dying and being born simultaneously. The heat penetrated layers of tension she had carried so long she had forgotten what relaxation felt like. She sank deeper, and the water rose to her shoulders, to her neck, and tears began streaming down her face without her permission or understanding. She wept for the voyage, for the cramped hold where women had died silently so as not to waste the air of the living. She wept for the promises that had been lies and the future that had contracted into nothing. She wept for the brightness that had been slowly extinguished from her daughter's eyes. And as she wept, the water held her, buoyant and forgiving, asking nothing of her except that she exist in it. When she returned to the building before dawn, the other women were already stirring. She said nothing, but they saw something in her face, a softness that hadn't been there before, a renewal so subtle it might have been imagined. By the following evening she had guided Jin to the spring, and then another woman, and another. Within a week they had all made the pilgrimage. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. The women began speaking more, laughing in ways that didn't sound entirely hollow. They shared stories in the water, real stories, not the careful narratives they performed for survival. They spoke of families left behind, of the men they had loved, of the dreams they had held before the world had deemed those dreams frivolous. And in speaking, they became more fully human to each other. Had asked for nothing. He had simply maintained the path, ensuring it was safe, and left the spring untouched except for occasional repairs to the stone shelter he had built nearby. But his kindness had created something unexpected, not just a place to bathe, but a sanctuary, a space where their bodies were not instruments of labor but vessels deserving of care, a place where the frontier's cruelty could not reach them. On the 8th night, as soaked in the steaming water and watched the stars multiply above her, she heard voices approaching. Not women's voices, men's voices, rough and curious, drawing closer through the darkness. Section 3. New Beginnings and the Ripple Effect. The voices stopped at the edge of the spring. His body went rigid in the water, her mind already calculating escape routes, already preparing for violation. But then, his voice cut through the darkness, firm and uncompromising. This place is reserved for the Chinese women. You'll turn around and head back to town. There was a long silence. Could hear her own heartbeat, the subtle lap of water against stone, the struggle happening in the darkness between men's desires and one man's conviction. One of the intruders spat and cursed, but they left, remained at the perimeter of the pool until had dressed and emerged, his presence a boundary between her and the world's hunger. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Then I'll be here to turn them away again," he replied. Word of the spring spread differently than expected. Instead of becoming a point of conflict, it became something the town itself invested in. Formalized the arrangement with the town council, proposing that the hot spring be recognized as a public resource but scheduled for exclusive use by the Chinese women during designated evening hours. His logic was practical. Clean women meant clean laundry, which meant healthier miners, which meant more productivity. Greed, it turned out, could sometimes align with decency. 2 months into their discovery of the spring, Jin announced that she wanted to open a bathhouse in town. The idea seemed impossible until she explained her vision with a clarity that surprised everyone. She had apprenticed under a healer in Canton, she said, and the hot water reminded her of healing baths her grandmother had prepared. She wanted to create a small establishment where townspeople, all townspeople, could pay for access to heated water, and, if they desired, herbal treatments for ailments. "They will never allow a Chinese woman to own a business," one of the older women said flatly. But Jin looked too, and he nodded slowly. "I'll help you acquire the building and establish the permits. The town council will listen to me." Within 6 months, Jin's bathhouse stood on the corner of Main Street and 4th, its windows glowing amber in the evenings, steam curling into the frontier air like an invitation. It became unexpectedly popular. Miners came to soak their aching muscles. Ranchers arrived dusty and exhausted, seeking relief. Even some of the more progressive townspeople's wives began visiting, drawn by Jin's knowledge of herbs and remedies. She taught them about ginger for digestion, lavender for sleep, eucalyptus for clarity. The bathhouse became a space of exchange, not just commerce, but the subtle alchemy of knowledge and care. Took a different path. She had always possessed a gift for languages, and with encouragement, she began studying English in the evenings. By the 2nd year, she was fluent enough to serve as a translator between the Chinese community and the town's institutions. When disputes arose, and they always did, she could articulate the women's needs and grievances in terms the town council understood. She became indispensable, and indispensability conferred a kind of protection. Now 14, discovered an unexpected talent for mathematics. The town's accountant, a man named, hired her to help with bookkeeping after she demonstrated her abilities. She worked after her laundry shift, hunched over ledgers in a small office, her careful handwriting recording the economic life of the frontier. She was paid fairly, and for the first time since arriving, she was building something that belonged to her alone. But the true shift in the town's perception came during the winter of the 2nd year. A mine collapse trapped 12 workers underground. The town mobilized frantically, and it was the Chinese women who provided continuous hot meals, clean bandages soaked in Jin's herbal preparations, and the physical labor of hauling debris. They worked alongside the miners' wives and the townspeople without distinction, united by the simple human need to save lives. When the men were finally extracted, 9 alive, 3 tragically lost, the survivors spoke of the gentle hands that had tended their wounds, the warm food that had sustained them, the quiet strength of women who had known hardship and refused to let it embitter them. The town gathered at the spring on the anniversary of the bathhouse's opening. It was an unofficial celebration, impromptu and genuine, had suggested it, and to his surprise, the town council had endorsed it. There was music, fiddles and drums, and food prepared by women from both communities. Chinese dishes alongside frontier fare. Children played together without the wariness that had characterized their earlier interactions. An elderly rancher approached and, in halting words, thanked her for the translation work that had helped settle a dispute fairly. As night fell, the women gathered at the natural spring, as they did most evenings now, though they were no longer alone, stood at a respectful distance. Several townspeople sat quietly on the rocks surrounding the pool, simply observing, understanding somehow that they were witnessing something sacred. Stood waist-deep in the steaming water beside her and looked up at the stars that had watched over them through every trial. "We are home," whispered, pulled her daughter close, and in that moment, surrounded by water that had become the geography of their salvation, by a community that had learned slowly but finally to see them as fully human, she realized that survival had transformed into something rarer and more precious: belonging. The frontier that had threatened to destroy them had instead become the place where they had discovered their own unbreakable strength, and in sharing that strength, had changed everyone it touched.